So we were talking a little bit about the tomb of Seti I, KV17, so not the temple that we have discussed with the hieroglyphs, but the tomb. And what I wanted to show you is that this is part of the basis of my answer to, for instance, the Afrocentrist community, among others, when they were talking about the real and true color of the Egyptians. Now, given this is a lot more interesting and deep than the skin tone of a population. In fact, if anything, that's one of the least interesting aspects of an ancient civilization. It's just that it's unfortunately a battlefield for war within the culture war, and therefore that's why it's often brought up. But today I don't necessarily want to focus on that too much. I'll present a couple of things, a couple of points, but I do want to discuss the broader point, which can be used when talking about preservation of pigments in both the Bronze Age, Iron Age, all the way up to classical antiquity, and how color and pigments react to exposure to the weather, but also, unfortunately, manumission and intervention of external sources, including us, human beings. So, you know, when I said very early on, as I was showing you a little bit about this study, which once again is from the University of Florence, for you who are interested, it was the Department of Architecture, University of Florence, Italy. The reason why you have a connection between the tomb of Seti I and the University of Florence is the same reason as to why you have the same connection with France, Louvre, in fact. And that's because if you look at this image on the right, you will notice that this is the map, the 2D map of the tomb of Seti I that we've just discussed. And as you see, there is a staircase. And so you enter, and as you go into section F to section G, and you go up the staircase as you are exploring the tombs, then you'll notice that in this zoomed in picture, you will notice that on both sides of these walls, the walls are covered with artistic representations and pictorial art. And two plates, we could say, were removed by archaeologists. One was sent to the Florence Egyptian Museum, and it is found there right now. And the other one was sent into the Louvre Museum and can be found and examined there. That's why you have this connection. Elements were removed and these elements were transported. And unfortunately, at least when we talk about the one in Italy, these were not preserved well at all, which is really, really a shame. Look at this. On the right, we see the original picture, photograph, of the current conditions of this drawing that we see here. You will notice that, they have got black hair. Both the queen and the pharaoh have got black hair. Their skin is very dark. They've got some gold. We see some green, some blue. We can see all of this. The one on the left is how the original colors would have looked. Blue hair and blue horns on the crown. So basically what's happening here, which is one of the main items of debate and clash with the Afrocentric community when I made several videos on ancient Egypt, is that one of the main points of debate is that they say, they do it for the skin, I'm not interested in the skin right now, but in general, the main point of debate and argument is that these are ancient, and so the colors fade, and so whatever color we see, the original would have been darker. The reality that has been proven without any shade of a doubt by this study, I will give you a link, is that in this specific case with the tomb of Seti I, and there are several other occasions in which this happens, not just in ancient Egypt, but also in classical antiquity in the Mediterranean basin, is that oftentimes the opposite happens. Pigment darkens with time. Darkens with time. So it depends. There is no, if you hear an umbrella statement, pigment fades away, so the colors were always darker, that's wrong. In this case specifically, blue became black. Now, if you really want to talk about the ethnicity, whatever, yeah, the queen had dark skin. Totally. I would consider this a brown skin. So, yeah, sure, great, fantastic. As you know, there is a veritable cornucopia of different skin tones because, in my worldview, my position, ancient Egypt was a multi-ethnic civilization. They had people with different skin tones, as we see the way they represented themselves in art and how they represented other people. By the way, In this specific tomb, there is the very famous, some say infamous, representation of not only themselves, but also the Nubians, who are clearly black, and different from the regular Egyptian, whose skin is instead a mixture of brown and red, if we want to look at the pigments used. But do remember, oftentimes the pigments, the way they look now, are darker because of the aging. And then we see Asiatics, sometimes we see Romans, and Romans look European. The Romans look just European. Some have like kind of very fair skin. Brown hair has been shown as a representation of Romans. Black hair has been shown as a representation of Romans. So if you cut my hair, I could have been a good representative of a Roman when it comes to both, in some cases, when it comes to both skin and complexion. But sometimes they have a lighter brown as well that's shown in Egyptian representations of Romans. And then you have the Asiatics tend to be very light skinned, and so are the Libyans. And you can recognize the Libyans because they have an ostrich feather on their head, ostrich being a connection that the ancient Egyptians recognized with the Libyans specifically. And so we will see all of this. I'll show you some of this stuff. I do just want to focus on this because the study shows phenomenal evidence that demonstrates that color and pigment can darken with time. You can even see it with a naked eye. And they did not use the naked eye. They used all sorts of technology, like for instance the XRF spectra and a lot of other stuff that I've already actually described in details in one of my videos. Now it's been a while since I read it when it comes to the technical aspects of it. It is spectroscopic analysis, and and it's proven a lot of the art that we see was lighter. Yeah, there we go. Look, to connect to what the archaeologist that we talked about was saying about how you prepare these walls before you start inscribing the hieroglyphs, the figures were first sketched in red, as I was telling you. The final outlines were then traced in black by another artist to create the final and correct guide for the sculptor. A coating, thin, gypsum, I don't know how to read it, you'll have to help me with this, based preparatory layer was given to ensure a homogeneous background from the chromatic and absorption point of view. The high technical quality of the tombs of Thebes, also due to the excellent quality of the rock, a fine, homogeneous and compact limestone, ensured a good preservation of the paintings observed by many travelers of the past. So already we see that someone in chat actually earlier on was saying, how are they so perfectly sketched? Because they prepare them. The main in situ causes of degradation of these architectures are infiltration of water with the consequent transport of salts, detachment of and fall of fragments, as we were discussing, but also cracks due to the mechanics of the rock layers. They reuse as dwellings, barns, hermitages, warehouses can have caused different transformations over the centuries, from carbon black deposits of lamps and fireplaces till the cuts in the rock walls. Yeah, and then there is the whole section where I remember that they discussed that, and as I say, I did read the letters where they say that look at this, exactly this. I want to read this last thing. Giambattista Belzoni discovered the tomb in 1817, but in reality it was discovered by Zahi Hawass because he discovered everything. But anyways, and he immediately realized its importance, describing it as the principal, open quotes, the principal, the most perfect and splendid monument in that country, close quotes. He did make drawings and wax casts, that already, of many decorations and staged an exhibition in England in 1821. The conservation conditions were good, and many of the early visitors said that the colors were as fresh as if the painters had just finished their work. This is mind-blowing. The plates attached to his publication document some of the removed reliefs still in place. The opening through began a long degenerative process since the following year when a flood caused the fall of fragments from walls and ceilings. So similar situations happened in the temple of Seti I as well. And when you read one more thing that I want to add to this, and there was a practice that happened when there was a craze with tourists. And what they would do is that they would create wet paper casts of the hieroglyphs and also a lot of the art. So what that does is that they would take like a paper, damp it and put it on top of the wall, and that would take some of the pigments and kind of create a little bit of a carbon copy of it, and then they could sell it. This was done a lot, which was a disgrace, and that ruined a lot of these. So the preservation is different to the way it was. And some of the reasons, again, when we look at these, we may think it's because it's 1,000 years old. The reality is because of all the nonsense that happened in the last 200 years. And that also connects to one of the points that I was presenting during my counter-argument when I was discussing with some of my intellectual opponents on what the ancient Egyptians looked like. Because one thing that happened is that there is an image I'm going to show you right now, and then we'll close with this topic. We'll start the next topic. But I want to show you this image. And it takes us to this, from, as I say, the tomb of SETI I. I'm going to give you a little presentation of this because it's fascinating.
Welcome to the inner circle.
Welcome to the inner circle. All right, we're going to vote, guys. Which one is the best voice? The angel voice or the demon voice? We'll have to decide. I think they're both pretty cool. When we were talking about this, so this image is found in the tomb of SETI I, as I was describing, and it's an image that represents the way the ancient Egyptians saw themselves. So the guy on the right is an ancient Egyptian, this is an Asiatic, this is a Nubian, and this is a Libyan, okay? And I want to specify that this is a drawing that represents an image on the wall. This is not from ancient Egypt. I think it's kind of obvious if you look at it, but just to make sure that we understand each other, this is just a drawing made by an Egyptologist. What's interesting about this is that we're going to look at the original on the wall. I have it right here, okay? So this is not the original, but this is the full image. Okay, this is a full image, and it was made. Minutoli is the name of the Egyptologist. Minutoli's reproduction. One thing about Minutoli already that I want to discuss is the fact that Minutoli is an eyewitness. So he went. This is the original wall. I'm going to show you. There we go. So this is where we take all of this. This is where we take all of this. I've done an analysis of it, and I'm going to share it with you right now. One thing that I want to say about Minutoli that connects to what we were discussing today is that Minutoli went there before all the crazy degradation happened, is an eyewitness, and we've just discussed how vivid and well preserved the tomb was. We just read it. We read all the information about it. He had access to it before everything went to shit hit the fan. And then he drew, he had created the drawing, he commissioned someone to create the drawing, and he said, yes, that's a good representation, because he couldn't take the freaking wall and bring it home, luckily, since people have done that, and he wanted to show it back home in Europe. So I believe Minutoli more than someone who looks at it now and draws conclusion, also because often these conclusions come from a place of culture and messages rather than whatever the heck, an actual analysis, an in-depth analysis of the data. So having given that, let's have a look at the current situation with this section of the wall, right? And then let's see what we can learn from it as we correlate with this drawing. So, of course, when we look at the drawing, we see that there is a massive difference between what the ancient Egyptian, the average ancient Egyptian looks like. I would say that I would go as far as saying that this is probably a typical representation of an ancient Egyptian of the Delta area, so the lower Egypt, the one that is closer to the sea and the Mediterranean, rather than a typical ancient Egyptian in Upper Egypt, which was bordering with Nubia, because that area, in my opinion, would have had a higher percentage of people that, even though they were originally Nubians, their forefathers, then their children in that area, they would have looked like a Nubian, not necessarily this level of black. This is just an example, of course, it's a stereotype. But stereotypes sometimes, even though they may not be descriptive of minutiae, they can still give you a general idea, just like the Romans telling us that Germanic people were blonde, exception the ones in Scotland, they tell us they're redheads. Okay, I'm not saying that every single ancient Germanic tribes, they were all copy-paste, every single one with blonde hair, but if the Romans give us that stereotype, it probably means that there was a higher percentage of Germanic people that had those phenotypic characteristics. And I think we can apply the same logic here. I think this is a typical inhabitant of the Delta. I'll get hatred for it, I don't care. And this is a typical inhabitant of Nubia, and maybe of some Egyptians, a certain percentage within the Egyptian population clusters in Upper Egypt, which bordered with Nubia, for obvious reasons. That could be also a representation of an Egyptian. And here, on the walls, we see a clear distinction. And we also see that the Libyans tend to be very fair-skinned. Now, according to the Afrocentric perspective, this is not a representation of the typical skin of a Libyan. Apologies for that. I don't know what happened there. I think it is. I personally, maybe not this milk white, but still, maybe kind of like me. Could be an idea. I think so. I think it would be a good representation. Now, it's amazing. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. You see, I just scratched the surface. There's a lot to say about this. All right, so what I do show in this section here is this. So, first, we need to try and understand which part of the wall we are looking at. And I think you can immediately recognize the black gentleman here, the Nubian, is over here. And then we need to find this guy. We need to find this guy. Now, what in this situation, and again, I'm not trying to look, this is the Nubian. This is a bad representation of a Libyan, because if you look at the wall and you look what's right next to the Nubian, you can clearly see that this looks nothing like this. So Minutoli didn't know what he was doing with his drawing. This is a wrong interpretation, because even though Minutoli did find elements of people that were found on this wall, he didn't draw them in the same order as the wall. And you can see this because if I play it, boom, this is where he got this guy, not here. And once you do this and you zoom in, as we will, and you identify it, you can immediately spot the ostrich feather, and I think it's actually a very good representation of what we see here. And here we see a bunch of Egyptians. Once again, do remember that as we have proven with the study from the University of Florence, their colors would have been lighter. We can kind of even see it here a little bit. Do they look white? No, obviously. No one is saying that the Egyptians were white, but definitely they did not look like this either. So we zoom in, we recognize the blue a little bit here. It's such a shame that it's gone, so much of it, but we do recognize it. And yeah, I think there is no way that I think the skin, maybe it went a little too light here, but still, this is not a brown man, this is not a black man, this Libyan is represented. The tattoos are still intact, and that's another characteristic of this culture, by the way. And here, which is, because again, another thing that I brought up on this video when I presented it, was the fact that oftentimes it is also a matter of which picture are you using? Are they using flash? What kind of illumination is there? So this is why it's wrong to just show one image of a wall and call it a day. You need to show multiple. And if you do show multiple, then you will see that, yeah, this is kind of a pink skin tone. And you can recognize it, and there is no way that you can tell me that this guy was a black African. You can still see the pigment, it's there, and it's quite clear. Regardless of the ethnic part, which is, as I say, it's the least interesting and the least important when it comes to these things, it is fascinating. This looks a little bit black. It was blue. And in fact, you can still kind of see it a little bit. We go. And you can see the Asiatic in the drawing is the one that was kind of lightened a bit too much, but in the original, we can still see the kind of complexion that he would have had, and we can still see the original red as part of his girth, or would you call it apron, that he was wearing here. So yeah, this is part of the tomb, and then there is a lot that goes into this also. But yeah, so it's a fascinating section, it's a fascinating representation. But as a one last thing I want to say, yeah, this color is actually kind of similar, because do remember, this is what they look like now, after the degradation and the darkening. So is it really so strange to believe that what Minutoli represented when he chose this specific tone wasn't what he actually saw? I can see this getting a little lighter and getting into this 100%. Give it 200 years, considering the studies that we have reviewed. I think I trust Minutoli. I do trust his eyewitness and expertise. The guy was an Egyptologist. But Granma told me, yeah, but then of course Netflix will bring Granma, and here we are.